early days of August 1914, the world was teetering on the edge. The July crisis had resulted in war being declared between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Russia had jumped in on the Serbian side. France and Germany were sniping at each other, verbally, not physically. Accusations were being thrown left and right. And England stood quietly, wondering what it should do. Unbeknownst to most of the powers involved, Germany had sent an ultimatum to Brussels, the capital of Belgium. Now, Belgium was an interesting place. It had been created almost diplomatically, although there was some revolt issues involved. But since the early part of the 1800s, since 1830 on, and particularly since 1870, Belgium had been guaranteed under international law to be neutral in any European conflict. In fact, this neutrality was so deeply ingrained that there were nations, including Great Britain, that had sworn that if any nation, friend or foe, violates Belgium neutrality, we will declare war on them. Period. It's just the way it is. The problem that Germany had was that British guarantee was based on Belgium's acceptance of that neutrality. If Belgium could be persuaded to allow troops to pass through her, everything would be fine. Neutrality would be honored, honor would be taken care of, and there you go. And the problem the Germans had was something called the von Schlieffen Plan, which was this idea von Schlieffen had to swing like an arc anchored on the Alsace-Lorraine and swing the German army to the Channel through Belgium and down onto Paris. It was a brilliant plan, but it required violating Belgium neutrality. Belgium's in the way. Belgium is problematic. Will Belgium fight? Will Belgium stand for its neutrality? Will England declare war if we do this? And so on August 3rd, actually August 2nd of 1914, Germany sent Belgium a note that said, stand to or else. It wasn't a declaration of war. In fact, they were very careful in how they worded it, that they demanded the right of passage through Belgium, and they were going to do it whether they had to do it peacefully with Belgium's permission or by, quote, force of arms, unquote. It was very carefully worded. It was not, like I said, a declaration of war. In concurrence with that, they made a bunch of promises. Hey, we'll fix anything we break, we'll pay indemnities, and when we're done, we'll make the French pay you a lot of money because they're the reasons we have to do this. The problem, of course, is that none of the German accusations against France were true, and this entire thing was based on a Balkans issue, crisis, that had somehow or another led to German accusations of France bombing Germany with Zeppelins and the like, and this insane German claim that France was going to invade Belgium to try to get at them. And so they were invading Belgium to keep France from invading Belgium, and in the process of this, both sides were going to end up violating Belgian neutrality, which meant that Britain was somehow or another going to get involved. And there was this belief that, well, maybe Britain won't get involved. Maybe Britain will see that the right of our cause, both sides thought. Belgium, of course, in a meeting of its parliament that day, rejected the ultimatum. And in what is considered to be one of the more inspiring moments of European history, King Leopold II was magnificent in his rejection of the German ultimatum. The weird thing that happened was that Belgium had essentially in 1914 had become already basically a socialist republic. Socialism was their goal. They were trying to become more, well, socialistic without necessarily understanding what that would mean. They had neglected their armed forces because in a socialist utopia, you don't need an army, theoretically. And indeed, the Minister of War in Brussels was considered to be persona non grata. They didn't like him. By virtue of his position, he was the least popular man in the entire country. Well, when the Belgian parliament decided to reject the German ultimatum, suddenly Belgium became very belligerent, very, very patriotic, and very militaristic. As Mr. Miller taught me all those years ago, the causes of World War I, militarism, nationalism, and imperialism. Well, all three of those came into play in Belgium. Belgium was an imperial country, colonies in Africa. Suddenly they became nationalistic because Germany was threatening them, and suddenly they cared about their military, which they hadn't hitherto done. Of course, it was too late at that point, but at least they made a show of it. And Germany, in what was, in many ways, the blunder of all blunders in history, answered the question forever, who are the baddies? There was a great deal of debate about World War I, who was really at fault, who was really this, who was the bad side. And keep in mind that in the United States, it was never clear. As late as 1917 and well into 1918, there was a significant portion of the population of America, the United States, citizenry, that supported Germany, believed Germany was in the right, that England and France were the wrong. It really wasn't clear, except for this one thing that Germany did. And you can say, well, they sank the Lusitania, Dave. Yeah, they did. They sank other ships too. But the one thing that Germany really did that forever decided the question, who's the aggressor and who's the righteous here, was invading Belgium, violating Belgian neutrality. And that ultimatum that they sent to Belgium essentially became a declaration of war. And a day or so later, the German troops entered Belgium, even before the German Reichstag was aware of it. And when Bethmann Hollweg, the German chancellor, stood before the Reichstag on August 4th, he made the case that, well, this is his exact quote. Listen to this. Our invasion of Belgium is contrary to international law, but the wrong, and I speak openly, that we are committing, we will make good as soon as our military goal has been reached. In his mind, it was a case of military necessity, and as he put it, necessity knows no law. The blunder in all of this was that most people had considered up to that point Germany's threat to invade Belgium as a bluff. France considered it a bluff. France was completely convinced that it was a fake, that it was a complete feint in the wrong direction to get them to move their army towards Belgium, towards the border with Belgium. England thought it was a bluff. The United States thought it was a bluff. Why did we all think it was a bluff? Because it was insane. You understand that? If Germany were to invade Belgium, it would guarantee that they were the bad guys. It would be a crime. It would be an international crime. It would be labeled as forever the people that violated the neutrality of Belgium and dragged all of Europe into a war because of all these countries that had pledged guarantees to Belgium. And so many people believed that it was just a bluff. They're just saying that because they want us to move our armies this way, or they want us to be distracted over here, and what they're really going to do is attack over there. Well, of course, Germany didn't. It wasn't a bluff. And that really, in many ways, is the biggest blunder in modern history. I know we can talk about Hitler and invading Russia and blah, 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 but Napoleon invading Russia. But really, the Germans invading Belgium in 1914 is a blunder that set Europe and the world on a course that we're still sailing today. Do you understand that? The repercussions of that first German soldier crossing that Belgian frontier in 1914 are still with us today. It's scary to think about what the impact of all that was. And at the time, you can go back in newspapers, and I love my newspapers.com subscription. I renewed it a few weeks ago, and I can sit here for hours and just peruse newspaper after newspaper after newspaper, and the newspapers of the day are just filled with international coverage, analysis, commentary, criticism of this German threat and this German move to invade Belgium. It was the biggest news in the world because it was clear what it was going to cause. I got up this morning, January 23rd, 2021, to the news that a news conference had been held in Moscow. The news conference was held by one Vladimir Putin, who you may know is the emperor of all Russia. I know he claims to be whatever. I don't even know what frankly, I don't even know what he claims to be as his position, but he is the Tsar of Russia. I mean, he's either the Tsar or the chairman of the party. I'm not sure which it is, but he's in charge of Russia, and nothing happens in Russia that he doesn't decide happens. He was holding a news conference before 500 journalists today. Now, that's not really a news conference. That's a speech with a couple of questions taken somewhere along the way. But before 500 journalists today, Vladimir Putin informed the world that if we don't do what he wants, if we don't listen to his ultimatum, he doesn't want to go to war, but he's willing and ready to do it. What are his demands, you might be asking? Well, oddly enough, you probably won't find out in the news, depending on who you watch. I watched 2 hours of my news this morning, didn't see a single reference to this story, not one. In point of fact, it's not even on my Facebook news feed. It's barely in my Google news feed. I actually had to follow it via Twitter because that was the only place I could really find any information on it. This insane demand that the West must meet. That's what he said this morning. Putin said the West must meet my demands. They must stand aside and do what I want them to do, or else, by force of arms, it's not a declaration of war, but it's a hint that war is a possibility. It's an insane demand. If you think about it, it's no less insane than Germany's ultimatum to Belgium, to Brussels in 1914. Why would you do this? It's insane. It's irrational. It's, what's that word? Oh yeah, crazy. His demands are, on the one hand, you know, it's like that old Steve Martin routine, right? When you're holding a hostage, you make your demands. I want a getaway car. I want $10 million in cash. And I want the letter M stricken from the alphabet. You always have to make one crazy demand so that people, you know, later on will think you're crazy. His demands don't seem on the surface all that unreasonable. What he wants is he wants a security guarantee that Ukraine will never be part of NATO, and that consequently, U.S. missiles will never be based in Ukraine. Now, on the surface of it, that makes sense. On the surface of it, you look at that and go, well, okay, Ukraine will never be part of NATO. Okay. The problem with that demand is this is not something that can be promised in perpetuity. It can't be something that can be promised forever. It can't be arranged by treaty because Ukraine has to have a decision in all of this. It's an independent nation, although Putin doesn't think so. His statement this morning was that Russia, Soviet Russia, Vladimir Lenin in particular, quote, created Ukraine, unquote, which is just more evidence that he's insane. But they have to have some say in this. And of course, they want to be part of NATO because it benefits them. And there are other issues at play here with regards to the interconnection of the European economy and European infrastructure that they won't have if they don't become part of NATO. The missiles thing, I'm kind of out on that, because really, why do we need missiles in Ukraine? I mean, frankly, and I put this as the hawk here, putting United States missiles into Ukraine, is redundant. I mean, unless you're just trying to annoy people. I mean, I get on my wife all the time because I load the dishwasher a specific way. And people, I know they're doing it on purpose. I know they're doing it just to annoy me. They load it wrong, and it just annoys me. I said the other day, you're just doing this to annoy me, aren't you? It doesn't really affect anything. It's not going to change anything. U.S. missiles in the Ukraine wouldn't change anything, but it would annoy the Russians. Maybe there's something good for that. What Ukraine does get is $2.5 billion in U.S. military aid. Did you know that? $2.5 billion in U.S. military aid. Now I realize that's a drop in the bucket. I mean, what was the story yesterday? The Secret Service discovered $100 billion in misappropriated COVID relief funds. I mean, really, who's shocked by that? But they do get military aid, and in fact, Ukraine announced yesterday that they were testing a specific type of that aid that they had gotten, a specific missile that we had sent them, and they were testing it against a Russian type of tank deployed the way the Russians would deploy it, just to see if it would work against that. And lo and behold, it did. Imagine that. So you put that on Twitter, of course, so that the Russians see it and go, well, maybe we should change our tactics. Doesn't make any sense to me. We have made threats against Russia that we could disconnect them from something called SWIFT, SWIFT, which is I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but it's an international monetary transfer system. It's how Russia sells its oil and gas and gets paid instantaneously. Think of it as Zelle or PayPal for nations. We could disconnect them from that, but Russia has said that if we do that, it would be a declaration of war against Russia. Think about 1940 in Japan and the economic sanctions that we placed against Japan. Now, again, we weren't there, and I'm not judging history by this. It's not what I'm saying. But you can't argue that those economic sanctions were used by certain elements of the Japanese government to rationalize and justify going to war in 1941. It's weird to me how so much is repeating itself here. And you have to ask yourself the question, since President Biden says no war in Ukraine, Woodrow Wilson said no war in Europe for America until 1917. Then he decided we needed to. Just because President Biden says no war over Ukraine doesn't necessarily mean that he means it. Is the Ukraine going to be the trigger point for a new European war? Now, logic says no. Logic says, Dave, you're insane. There's no way. In today's world, nobody would go to war. Except we're not dealing with logical, rational people and events here, are we? Logic, rationality said Germany would never invade Belgium, because if they did, that would guarantee them, number one, it would guarantee them that they were the bad guys, and number two, it would almost guarantee that they would lose, because there's no way they could win a two-front war. And in 1914, Britain was guaranteed to fight against Germany to stop a German hegemony over Europe. It was going to happen no matter what. What happens in 2022 with a Russian invasion of Ukraine, takeover of Ukraine, and an effective Russian control of the European economy through energy sources, because much of Europe's energy comes from Ukraine. What happens then? Oh, we're going to sanction them. Hasn't worked so far. Oh, but Dave, it's hurt their economy. Has it? And even if it has, experience tells us that hurting somebody's economy is not exactly the best way to keep them from going to war, because irrational people do irrational things. And if you push them into a corner and they only see one way out, what do? I don't necessarily think we should go to war over Ukraine, but at the same time, it's odd to me how repetitive this is and how similar this is to August of 1914, with Putin out there now demanding this empire, this second-rate empire with inferiority complexes, demanding that people do things that it wants to do or else, without ever seeming to understand that if they do the things that they're threatening to do, A, they're going to lose, and B, they're going to be the bad guys. The weirdest part of all this, though, like I said, is that there's almost no news coverage of this at all. None. Vladimir Putin this morning issued an ultimatum to the world. You give me the guarantees that I want, or else I will go to war over Ukraine. And the collective response of the world has been kind of a, okay, whatever. Oh my God, Omicron is going to kill us all. I've had more stories about Omicron today and the fact that we're all going to die. Did you know 40% of Americans are guaranteed to get the Omicron? 40% of you. Us, me. Guaranteed we're going to get it. And millions of Americans are going to die. That's the news today. On August 3rd of 1914, Edward Grey, who was the Foreign Secretary of England, was meeting with a friend who was morose over what was happening. And he made that comment, I fear that the lights are going out all over Europe. And I don't know that we will live to see them lit again. At least in 1914, they were paying attention to it. 2021, I'm not sure we are. We're so obsessed with the minutia, the Omicron, the cancellation of NFL games, the game shows. I wonder if we're paying any attention to what's going on at all. We're paying any attention to the fact that Russia, the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, is ready and willing to start another war. They've said that. Yes, it's insane. Yes, it's crazy. Yes, it's irrational. But those are exactly the kind of people that make insane, crazy, irrational decisions. And while there may be time for lamentation later, what happens in the meantime?